Miss Marple and the Woman Who Brought Babies to the Funeral. Welcome to Cafe Tales. I'm your host, Ailey, and I cannot tell you how much joy it brings me to know you choose to spend your evenings with these stories. Each tale takes time and love to prepare, but your kindness and the way our little community grows make it all so meaningful. Thank you for being such a wonderful audience. If you haven't yet, do subscribe so you never miss a new mystery. Now, let's gently turn the page and begin tonight's story. Chapter 1. Black Crape and a Pram. The gray September sky pressed down upon St. Mary Mead like a mourner's veil, heavy with the promise of rain that would not quite fall. From her cottage window, Miss Jane Marple watched the small procession making its way toward the church, black figures moving with the measured solemnity that death demands of the living. Mr. Aldous Finch was to be laid to rest this afternoon, and it seemed the whole village had turned out to pay their respects. He had been, as Miss Marple reflected while adjusting her own black hat, a most respectable man, careful with money, his own, and more importantly, the parish's, and possessed of that particular brand of stern reliability that made him an ideal treasurer for over 20 years. The church bell tolled its mournful note as Miss Marple made her way down the path, her neat black shoes clicking against the wet stones. She paused at the lich gate, where Tom Ransom, the undertaker's man, had arranged a small tray of funeral biscuits and weak sherry for the mourners. The poor man looked quite soaked already, despite the morning's stubborn refusal to properly rain. "Good afternoon, Miss Marple," came Lady Bantry's familiar voice. Dolly Bantry appeared at her elbow, resplendent in black silk. That must have cost more than most of the villagers spent on clothing in a year. Dreadful weather for a funeral, isn't it? Though I suppose any weather is dreadful for such an occasion. Miss Marple murmured her agreement, but her attention was caught by an unusual sight. Coming up the church path was a woman she did not recognize. A neat, self-possessed figure in black, pushing before her a large perambulator. The woman's veil was of the finest crepe, properly deep for mourning, and she moved with the careful, practiced steps of one accustomed to maneuvering a pram over uneven ground. "How extraordinary," Lady Bantry whispered, following Miss Marple's gaze. "Bringing babies to a funeral. That's certainly a new thing." The perambulator was indeed occupied by two babies, both appearing to be perhaps 6 months old, wrapped snugly against the dampness. The twin front wheels of the pram left a broad, neat track along the path. As the woman approached, Miss Marple noticed the stoneware foot warmer that peeped from beneath a carefully knitted rug. A sensible precaution on such a chilly day. "My sister's children," the woman explained to no one in particular, though her voice carried clearly in the hushed churchyard atmosphere. "She's poorly, I'm afraid, and couldn't attend. I'm Mrs. Rowan, Lydia Rowan. I thought it important that Mr. Finch should have proper attendance, even if it means bringing the little ones." Sister Ivy Madden, the district clinic nurse, approached with her characteristic brisk efficiency. Her sharp eyes took in the babies with professional interest. "Well cared for, I can see," she pronounced after a brief inspection, "though it's unusual to bring infants to such a solemn occasion." Mrs. Rowan's composure never wavered. "My sister was most particular that the family should be represented," she replied smoothly. "And babies, after all, are accustomed to sleeping through any amount of ceremony." As if to contradict this assertion, one of the babies began to fuss. Mrs. Rowan reached into the pram with a talc-powdered hand, hushing the child with practiced ease. The other infant required attention as well, and she produced a bottle, warming it by tucking it near the foot warmer before offering it to the hungry mouth. Miss Marple observed these domestic ministrations with the quiet attention she brought to all human behavior. There was something rather touching about the scene. The careful devotion to duty, the gentle efficiency with which Mrs. Rowan managed her charges, the way she seemed utterly at ease. despite being a stranger to the gathering. The mourners began to file into the church. Mrs. Hester Finch, the widow, appeared surprisingly composed for one so recently bereaved. She was much younger than her late husband, perhaps 25 years his junior, and her black dress was well cut and becoming. Mr. Basil Rudge, the haberdasher, bustled about with eager sympathy, clearly anxious to be seen doing his proper part as a pillar of the community. "Such a sad loss," Mr. Rudge was saying to anyone who would listen. "Poor Aldous, such a careful man, so devoted to the parish accounts. We shall miss his steady hand terribly." Miss Marple noted how Mrs. Rowan positioned her perambulator carefully under the shelter of the lich gate, ensuring the babies would remain dry should the threatening rain finally materialize. The foot warmer showed a recent scuff on its glazed surface. She noticed, perhaps from being knocked against the pram's frame during the journey. Inside the church, the service proceeded with proper solemnity. Reverend Leonard Clement's voice carried the familiar words of comfort and hope, while his wife Griselda, despite her natural vivacity, maintained the appropriate demeanor in the front pew. Dr. Haydock sat with his usual professional gravity, having no doubt attended to Mr. Finch in his final days. Mrs. Rowan remained near the back of the church, the perambulator beside her pew, ready to wheel the babies outside should they become troublesome. But the children slept peacefully, lulled perhaps by the rhythmic cadences of the prayer book and the warmth from their carefully tended foot warmer. Miss Marple found herself studying Mrs. Rowan's profile during the service. There was something almost theatrical about the woman's perfect composure, her neat black gloves, her properly arranged veil. The crepe was certainly new, no doubt purchased especially for this occasion, as befitted proper morning dress. Yet something troubled Miss Marple's observant mind. The inside edge of Mrs. Rowan's right glove showed a faint dusting of talc, which was natural enough given her care of the babies. But true morning crepe had a peculiar quality. It caught and held every particle of lint and dust. Mrs. Rowan's dress, however, appeared remarkably clean for crepe that should have attracted every mote of powder and debris. As the final hymn drew to a close, the first drops of rain began to patter against the church windows. The congregation stirred, gathering themselves for the brief journey to the graveside, where Mr. Finch would be committed to the earth beside his first wife. Dead these many years, Mrs. Rowan was already moving, wheeling her charges toward the door with efficient haste. "Must get the babies to shelter," she murmured to Miss Marple as they passed. "Can't have them catching cold." The perambulator's wheels traced their neat double track toward the lich gate once more, where Mrs. Rowan tucked the pram safely under the roof's protection. The babies slept on, undisturbed by the increasingly urgent drumming of rain on the ancient wooden beams above their heads. Chapter 2. The porch at the lich gate. The final notes of the hymn faded into the stone arches above, and Reverend Clement's voice rose in the ancient words of benediction. As he pronounced the closing, "Amen," the rain that had threatened all afternoon began in earnest, drumming against the diamond-paned windows with sudden urgency. The congregation stirred with a particular restlessness that comes when inclement weather disrupts funeral arrangements. The planned graveside service would have to be abbreviated, and mourners began gathering their belongings with the resigned efficiency of those accustomed to England's unpredictable climate. Miss Marple rose from her pew, her keen eyes automatically seeking the various members of the funeral party. Mrs. Finch remained seated for a moment longer, her black-gloved hands folded in her lap with the stillness of deep grief, or perhaps merely the exhaustion that follows prolonged strain. Mr. Finch's brother, a gentleman from Guildford whom Miss Marple remembered meeting once before, made his way toward the altar to speak with Reverend Clement about the altered arrangements. The crowd began to eddy toward the church doors, conversations resuming in the hushed tones appropriate to the occasion. Mr. Basil Rudge had positioned himself, near the center aisle, the better to offer loud sympathy to anyone within earshot. Such a devoted treasurer, he was saying to Dr. Haydock. He was. Never a penny out of place in all his years of service. The parish accounts were his pride and joy, you know. Always said he'd rather die than leave them in disorder. Sister Ivy Madden had made her way to where Mrs. Rowan waited with her perambulator, taking what appeared to be a professional interest in the baby's welfare. Miss Marple observed the brief exchange from across the aisle, noting the nurse's brisk assessment and Mrs. Rowan's unruffled responses to what were undoubtedly pointed questions about the propriety of bringing infants to such a gathering. "Quite well. Thank you," Mrs. Rowan said. "My sister trained as a nursemaid before her marriage, so she's most particular about their care. Even in her current indisposition, she insisted on proper feeding schedules." The rain intensified, and Tom Ransom appeared at the church doors, gesturing apologetically. "The graveside portion of the service will have to be postponed," he indicated, "until the weather clears." This announcement caused a flurry of discussion among the mourners, some pressing forward to express their condolences to the widow before departing, others lingering to gossip about the unusual circumstances. Mrs. Rowan was among the first to move toward the doors. "I really must get the children home," she explained to Lady Bantry, who had stopped to admire the babies. "They're feeding time, you understand, and this dampness can't be good for their chests." Miss Marple watched as Mrs. Rowan maneuvered the perambulator through the crowd with practiced skill. The woman had somehow managed to position herself near the front of the exodus, moving with the sort of quiet determination that suggested long experience in navigating public spaces with infant charges. The church porch provided temporary shelter from the downpour, and several mourners huddled there, reluctant to venture into the storm without proper umbrellas. Mrs. Rowan had already wheeled her charges beyond this bottleneck, and Miss Marple could see through the rain that the perambulator had somehow appeared under the lich gate, tucked neatly beneath the ancient wooden roof. "Most sensible," Lady Bantry observed, following Miss Marple's gaze, "though how she managed to get there so quickly in this weather is quite remarkable. One would think she'd have been soaked through." The porch gradually emptied as mourners made their dash for waiting vehicles or nearby homes. Miss Marple lingered, partly from a natural reluctance to venture into such weather, but more from that indefinable sense of unease that had troubled her throughout the service. Something about the afternoon's events felt subtly wrong, though she could not yet identify the source of her disquiet. Dr. Haydock had remained behind to speak with Reverend Clement about parish business, and their conversation drifted over the gradually quieting space. Mrs. Finch had been assisted to a waiting motor car by her late husband's brother, and Mr. Rudge was bustling about, making a great show of ensuring that all was properly secured before the church was locked. It was then that the cry came, a sharp exclamation of distress from somewhere near the church entrance. Miss Marple hurried toward the sound, her heart quickening with the premonition that something was gravely amiss. In the porch, partially sheltered from the driving rain but clearly affected by it nonetheless, a figure collapsed against one of the stone pillars. A small crowd had gathered around, Miss Marple's practiced. I took in the scene with the quick assessment of one who had witnessed too many such incidents over her long life. It was Mr. Aldous Finch, not safely interred in the earth as should have been the case, but the very man whose funeral they had just attended. He lay half-fallen against the porch pillar, his head at an unnatural angle, the order of service still crumpled in his lifeless hand. Dr. Haydock was already kneeling beside the body, his professional demeanor intact despite the shocking circumstances. His examination was swift but thorough, and when he looked up, his expression was grave. "A blow to the temple," he announced to the gathered mourners. "Quite forceful, I should say, though the wound is rather diffuse, as if from a rounded, heavy object rather than a sharp edge." Inspector Slack, summoned by Tom Ransom, arrived within minutes, his official manner barely concealing his irritation at being called out in such weather. He surveyed the scene with the weary expression of one who had dealt with too many sudden deaths in his career. "Wet stone and a weak heart," he pronounced after a cursory examination. Poor fellow. Probably felt faint from the strain of the service, stumbled against the pillar. These old men don't weather grief well, especially in weather like this. Miss Marple found herself studying the pillar against which Mr. Finch had fallen. The stone was indeed wet from the driving rain, but she could see no sharp paint mark or protruding element that might have caused such a wound. More puzzling still, there appeared to be a faint dusting of some white substance on the wet stone, hardly what one would expect from a simple fall. "Inspector," she ventured quietly, "might I suggest—" But Slack was already turning away, his mind clearly made up about the nature of the incident. Natural causes, Miss Marple. Sad, of course, but hardly mysterious. The strain of attending his own funeral service. Well, it's not the first time such excitement has proved too much for an elderly heart. Miss Marple blinked in confusion. His own funeral service, Inspector, but surely, figure of speech, of course, Slack said impatiently. The strain of the occasion, I meant. Poor fellow probably shouldn't have attempted to attend at all in his condition. As the body was prepared for removal, Miss Marple noticed that Mrs. Rowan's perambulator remained safely positioned under the lych gate, its occupants presumably sleeping peacefully through the commotion. "Most considerate," Lady Bantry remarked, following Miss Marple's glance toward the lych gate, though one does wonder how she managed to get the pram there so efficiently. "I could have sworn she was among the last to leave the porch, yet there it sits, dry as a bone under that roof." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully, her mind already beginning to turn over the small inconsistencies that were accumulating like autumn leaves in a gathering wind. The afternoon had begun as a simple, sad ceremony for a respected member of the community. Now it had become something else entirely, though what exactly remained to be determined. Chapter 3. Miss Marple Notices. Talctha. Rain had settled into a steady downpour by the time Inspector Slack concluded his examination and pronounced himself satisfied with the obvious explanation. Natural causes brought on by the strain of grief and inclement weather. A tidy conclusion that required no further investigation and allowed everyone to return to their homes with minimum inconvenience. Miss Marple, however, found herself reluctant to accept such a straightforward resolution. Experience had taught her that when small details failed to align properly, larger truths were often lurking beneath the surface, waiting to be uncovered by patient observation. As the other mourners dispersed, she remained in the church porch, ostensibly sheltering from the weather, but actually studying the scene with the methodical attention she might have brought to a particularly challenging piece of needlework. Lady Bantry, never one to abandon a friend to solitary contemplation, lingered beside her, despite the obvious discomfort of the damp stone surroundings. "Dreadful business," Dolly murmured, adjusting her black silk coat against the chill. Though I must say, Inspector Slack seemed remarkably certain about his conclusions. One might almost think he was in a hurry to be elsewhere. Miss Marple made a non-committal sound, her attention focused on the stone pillar where poor Mr. Finch had been discovered. The body had been removed, but the scene remained largely undisturbed, and she found herself drawn to examine the details that others had overlooked in their haste to reach comfortable conclusions. Mrs. Finch had departed with her brother-in-law, but not before Miss Marple had observed something rather interesting about the widow's mourning attire. Moving closer to where Mrs. Finch had stood during the discovery of the body, Miss Marple lightly touched the stone pillar, then examined her fingertips with the care of one accustomed to noticing such minutiae. "Dolly, my dear," she said thoughtfully, Would you mind terribly if I asked you to recall something specific about Mrs. Rowan's behavior during the service? Lady Bantry looked puzzled, but willing to cooperate. The woman with the perambulator? What particular aspect did you have in mind? Did you notice whether she ever lifted either of the babies completely out of the pram? Not simply attending to them within their wrappings, but actually removing them entirely? Dolly considered this carefully, her brow furrowed in concentration. Now that you mention it, I don't believe she did. She seemed quite capable of managing their needs without disturbing them overmuch. Warming bottles, adjusting blankets, that sort of thing. Rather practiced at it, I thought. Why do you ask? Instead of answering directly, Miss Marple moved to examine the stone pillar more closely. The surface was wet from the driving rain, but something else caught her attention. A faint dusting of white powder that clung to the rough stone despite the moisture. How curious, she murmured, touching the substance delicately with one gloved finger. One would expect rain to wash such things away quite thoroughly. The powder appeared to be talc, the sort used for dusting babies to prevent chafing and discomfort. Nothing unusual in that, given Mrs. Rowan's presence with her infant charges. But Miss Marple found herself puzzling over its location on the pillar where Mr. Finch had fallen. Moving her attention to the flagstone beneath the pillar, she discovered another small anomaly. A thin white ring marked the stone, barely visible, but distinct enough to catch the eye of one who knew how to look. The mark was perfectly circular, about the size that might be left by the bottom of a bottle or glass, but it had the particular appearance of dried milk, rather than any alcoholic beverage. Most peculiar, Miss Marple observed, kneeling carefully on the damp stone to examine the mark more closely. Dolly, you recall the refreshments Tom Ransom arranged under the lich gate. Was there milk offered among them? Certainly not, Lady Bantry replied promptly. Weak sherry and funeral biscuits, the usual arrangement. I can't imagine why anyone would bring milk into a church porch, particularly on such an occasion. Miss Marple rose and brushed off her skirts, her mind working over these small but troubling inconsistencies. She recalled Mrs. Rowan's careful ministrations to the babies, the talc-powdered hand that had soothed the fussing infant, the bottle that had been warmed against the foot warmer before being offered to the hungry child. But if Mrs. Rowan had never lifted the babies from their perambulator, and if she had wheeled them directly to the shelter of the lich gate without lingering in the church porch, how had talc come to be dusted on the pillar where Mr. Finch was found? And what could account for the milk ring on the flagstone? There's something else that troubles me, Miss Marple continued, moving toward the small arms ledge set into the wall of the porch. The matter of morning crepe and its particular properties, Lady Bantry followed, looking somewhat mystified by this apparent change of subject. You see, Miss Marple explained, true morning crepe has a most distinctive quality. It attracts and holds every particle of dust, lint, and powder with which it comes into contact, rather like a magnet for domestic debris. One might say, she paused before the arms ledge, where another faint but unmistakable ring marked the stone surface. This one, too, had the appearance of dried milk, though it was situated in a location where no refreshments should have been placed. Mrs. Finch's morning dress was perfectly proper, genuine crepe of the finest quality. But when I observed her sleeve as she leaned against this very pillar, I noticed something rather remarkable. What? Lady Bantry prompted, clearly intrigued despite her confusion about the direction of Miss Marple's observations. The fabric was immaculate. Not a trace of lint or powder clung to it, despite the fact that she had just spent considerable time in the proximity of Mrs. Rowan, who had been handling talc-dusted babies throughout the service. Miss Marple moved back to examine the pillar once more, this time paying particular attention to the location and pattern of the talc residue. Now, Mrs. Rowan's crepe, while certainly of good quality and proper depth for mourning, struck me as remarkably clean as well. But in her case, one would expect some evidence of her nursemaid duties, and indeed, her gloves showed clear signs of talc powder. "I'm afraid I don't quite follow your reasoning," Lady Bantry admitted. "Consider this, my dear. If Mrs. Rowan attended to the babies while remaining at the rear of the church, and if she then proceeded directly to shelter her charges under the lich gate, when and where did she have opportunity to dust talc onto this particular pillar? And why should there be evidence of milk in locations where no refreshments were served?" The implications of these questions hung in the damp air between them, made more ominous by the continued drumming of rain on the porch roof. "You're suggesting," Lady Bantry said slowly, "that Mrs. Rowan was not where she appeared to be at all times during the service?" "I'm suggesting," Miss Marple replied carefully, "that the evidence before us tells a story somewhat different from the one we observed. The question is whether these discrepancies are merely curious coincidences, or whether they point to something more deliberate." She glanced once more at the pillar, noting how the talc had settled into the natural depressions of the stone, creating a pattern that spoke of purposeful contact rather than accidental transference. "One often powders a baby," she murmured thoughtfully, "but one does not ordinarily powder morning crepe. Yet here we have powder where crepe should be clean, and clean crepe where powder might reasonably be expected." The afternoon was drawing toward evening, and the rain showed no signs of abating. Soon the church would be locked for the night, and any evidence that might clarify these puzzling details would be left to the mercies of weather and time. Miss Marple took one final look around the porch, committing every detail to memory, with the thoroughness of one who understood that truth often resided in the smallest particulars. Chapter 4. Milk on the Arms Ledge. The evening light was fading when Miss Marple and Lady Bantry finally ventured from the church porch, though the rain had mercifully diminished to a fine drizzle. The village wore that particular air of subdued melancholy that follows any funeral, made more pronounced by the day's unexpected and disturbing conclusion. As they walked slowly toward the lich gate, Miss Marple found herself drawn once more to examine the small arms ledge she had noticed earlier. The circular stain remained clearly visible despite the dampness, and she bent to study it more carefully in the gray twilight. "Most definitely milk," she pronounced after a moment's examination. "The residue has that particular quality, quite unmistakable once one knows what to look for." Lady Bantry peered over her shoulder with the fascination of one witnessing a master craftsman at work. "But surely that's impossible. I mean to say, who would bring milk into a church, particularly during a funeral service?" Before Miss Marple could reply, footsteps approached through the drizzle, and Sister Ivy Madden appeared, her nurse's cape pulled close against the weather. Her sharp features wore an expression of professional disapproval that suggested she had been dwelling on the afternoon's irregularities. "Miss Marple, Lady Bantry," she greeted them with her characteristic briskness. "I trust you've not been standing about in this dampness. Most inadvisable at your age." "We were just examining some rather curious evidence," Miss Marple replied mildly. "Sister Madden, in your professional experience, would any of your mothers ever consider bringing milk into a church?" The nurse's eyebrows rose sharply. "Certainly not. Most improper and quite unnecessary besides. Any properly prepared mother would have attended to feeding arrangements well before arriving at such a gathering." "The very idea." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "And yet here we have unmistakable evidence that milk has been present in this very porch, on the arms ledge, where no refreshments should have been placed." Sister Madden approached to examine the stain for herself, her professional eye taking in the details with practiced efficiency. "Milk, without question," she confirmed. "Fresh milk, I should say, from the appearance of the residue. But how extraordinarily inappropriate." "There's another matter that puzzles me," Miss Marple continued. Mrs. Rowan mentioned warming a bottle for one of her charges. Might you have observed whether the bottle remained warm throughout the service? As a matter of fact, I did notice, Sister Madden replied, her tone suggesting professional interest in proper infant care. When I examined the babies just before we entered the church, the bottle was quite warm. Properly prepared, I thought at the time. But when I encountered Mrs. Rowan later, as we were leaving the porch, I happened to touch the bottle by accident. Quite cool it was, and the teat showed no signs of recent use. Lady Bantry looked bewildered. But surely that's natural enough. Bottles cool after all, and babies don't always feed on schedule. Indeed, they do cool, Sister Madden agreed. But in my experience, a properly hungry infant will drain a bottle completely within minutes of receiving it. This one appeared untouched, which struck me as odd, given how thirsty the child had been earlier. Miss Marple absorbed this information with the careful attention she brought to all such details. The perambulator was equipped with a foot warmer, I noticed. A stoneware bottle, if I'm not mistaken. Most sensible arrangement. Many prams carry such devices, Sister Madden acknowledged. Filled with hot water at home, they retain heat for hours, essential for keeping babies comfortable in weather like this. Tom Ransom appeared through the gathering dusk, his undertaker's duties evidently complete despite the day's unexpected complications. He approached with the respectful manner appropriate to his profession, touching his cap to the ladies. "Begging your pardon," he said quietly, "but I couldn't help overhearing your conversation about foot warmers. Mrs. Rowan's pram had a fine one, proper stoneware bottle, well made. I noticed it particularly as we came out of the church." "Oh?" Miss Marple encouraged gently. "I brushed my hand past it by accident as I was helping arrange the crowd. Quite warm it was still, despite the length of the service. Struck me as odd, really, since most of them have cooled considerably after 2 hours or more." Miss Marple exchanged a meaningful glance with Lady Bantry. "You're quite certain it was still warm at that time?" "Warm as toast," Tom confirmed, which seemed peculiar given how long we'd been inside. "Those stoneware bottles hold their heat well, but not that well. Not ordinarily. The implications of this." Observation settled over the small group like the evening mist that was beginning to rise from the wet earth around them. Miss Marple found herself reconstructing the timeline of the afternoon's events, seeking to understand how a foot warmer could remain unusually warm while a feeding bottle cooled to room temperature. "Tom," she said thoughtfully, "in your experience with funeral arrangements, how often do visitors bring perambulators to services?" The undertaker's man considered this carefully. "Not common, I'd say. Mothers with young ones generally arrange for care at home during such occasions. Too disruptive, you see, and not really proper. This afternoon was the first time I recall seeing it done." "And the pram itself. Did you notice anything particular about its construction or condition?" Tom's weathered face showed the concentration of one trying to recall specific details. "Well-made piece, I thought. Not new, but well-maintained. The wheels move smooth as silk despite the wet path. Twin front wheels, they leave a distinctive track." "That sort does," Miss Marple nodded, filing this information away with the growing collection of small inconsistencies that surrounded Mrs. Rowan and her mysterious charges. "The apron of the perambulator," she continued. "Was it damp from the rain?" "Funny you should ask," Tom replied, his brow furrowing. "I expected it would be, given how the weather turned while we were inside. But when I saw it under the lich gate afterward, it appeared quite dry." "Well protected, I suppose, though how she managed to get it there so quickly in that downpour." He trailed off, shaking his head. Sister Madden had been listening to this exchange with growing interest. "There's something else that strikes me as irregular. A properly conscientious aunt bringing her sister's children to such a gathering would surely have inquired about medical facilities in case of emergency. Yet Mrs. Rowan asked no questions about my clinic, showed no interest in emergency arrangements. most unusual for someone caring for infants not her own. The gathering darkness made further examination of the physical evidence impossible, but Miss Marple felt that enough questions had been raised to warrant serious consideration. The pattern of small anomalies was beginning to suggest larger inconsistencies in Mrs. Rowan's story, discrepancies that might prove significant when viewed in the proper light. "I think," she said quietly, "that tomorrow morning might be an appropriate time to make some discreet inquiries about Mrs. Rowan and her supposed sister. There are too many small puzzles here to dismiss them all as mere coincidence." As the little group prepared to part ways, each returning to their respective homes through the misty evening, Miss Marple cast one final glance toward the lich gate, where Mrs. Rowan's perambulator had sat so conveniently sheltered from the storm. Something about the entire afternoon felt orchestrated rather than accidental, a performance designed to deceive rather than a simple act of family duty. The question that remained was what purpose such an elaborate deception might serve, and what connection it might have to the unfortunate Mr. Finch's untimely demise. Chapter 5. The Foot Warmer That Wasn't There. The morning after the funeral dawned crisp and clear, as if the previous day's rain had washed away more than merely the dust from St. Mary Mead's ancient stones. Miss Marple rose early, her mind already occupied with the various puzzles that had presented themselves during yesterday's disturbing events. After a light breakfast, she made her way to Lady Bantry's residence, knowing that her friend's natural curiosity would make her an eager companion for the morning's planned investigations. She found Dolly in her morning room, already dressed despite the early hour and clearly anticipating Miss Marple's arrival. "I've been thinking all night about your observations," Lady Bantry announced without preamble. "The more I consider them, the more convinced I become that something decidedly irregular occurred yesterday. Where shall we begin our inquiries?" Miss Marple settled herself in the comfortable chintz chair that Dolly always reserved for her visits. "I believe our first step should be to verify Mrs. Rowan's claims about her sister and the babies. If there are inconsistencies in her story, they may lead us toward understanding her true purpose." Their destination was the district clinic, where Sister Ivy Madden maintained meticulous records of all the mothers and infants under her care. The nurse greeted them with professional courtesy, though her expression suggested that she'd been expecting such a visit. "I took the liberty," Sister Madden announced without preliminary, "of reviewing my records after our conversation yesterday evening. Most illuminating, I must say." She led them to her small office, where ledgers and files were arranged with military precision. Opening the current register, she pointed to the relevant entries with a finger that trembled slightly with suppressed indignation. "No Rowan on my books," she declared firmly. "Not now, not ever. No mother too poorly to attend any gathering, and certainly no sister authorized to remove infants from my care for erring purposes. Most irregular and frankly quite impossible, under proper procedures." Miss Marple studied the neat columns of names and dates, her trained eye seeking any detail that might have been overlooked. "The babies Mrs. Rowan displayed, might they have belonged to other mothers in your care?" Sister Madden's lips compressed into a thin line of professional disapproval. "Indeed they might, and I believe they did. Mrs. Wayne and Mrs. Bid both have infants of precisely the size and age we observed yesterday. Both children were in their cots at the clinic during the noon hour, where they belonged." Lady Bantry looked shocked. "You mean to suggest that Mrs. Rowan somehow obtained these babies without proper authorization?" "I mean to suggest," Sister Madden replied acidly, "that someone with considerable knowledge of infant care and clinic procedures managed to borrow 2 babies for purposes that had nothing whatsoever to do with family duty or proper mourning observances." This revelation cast an entirely new light on the previous day's events. Miss Marple found herself reconsidering every aspect of Mrs. Rowan's behavior, searching for clues that might explain such an elaborate deception. "Sister Madden," she said thoughtfully, "would such a substitution require particular expertise, or could any determined individual have managed it?" The nurse considered this carefully. "The handling? Certainly, anyone with nursemaid training could manage the practical aspects. But the timing, the knowledge of our routines, the confidence to carry it through..." She paused meaningfully. "That would require someone familiar with medical procedures and infant care protocols." Armed with this disturbing information, Miss Marple and Lady Bantry made their way back through the village, their conversation subdued by the implications of what they had discovered. As they passed the church, Miss Marple suggested a brief examination of the grounds in daylight, hoping that yesterday's rain might have revealed additional evidence. The Lychgate area showed clear signs of the previous day's activities. The broad tracks left by the perambulator's twin wheels were still visible in the soft earth, and Miss Marple studied them with the attention of a skilled tracker following game. "Most interesting," she murmured, kneeling beside the clearest impression. "Dolly, observe how these tracks show the pram's movement. Here, where it approached the Lychgate, a straight, purposeful line." She indicated another set of marks. "But here, the wheels have been turned at an unusual angle, as if the pram were maneuvered with particular care, almost as if someone were positioning it quite deliberately for a specific purpose." Their attention was drawn to the old stone water trough that stood near the church boundary, used for generations to water horses during services. The trough was still filled from yesterday's rain, and something within it caught Miss Marple's sharp eye. Reaching carefully into the cold water, she withdrew a familiar object, the stoneware foot warmer that had been so prominently displayed in Mrs. Rowan's perambulator. The bottle was empty, its contents long since drained, and the cork stopper showed fresh marks where it had been recently handled. "How very curious," Miss Marple observed, turning the bottle in her hands. "Why should a foot warmer, ostensibly needed to keep babies warm, find its way into a water trough?" Lady Bantry examined the bottle with growing amazement. "And look here, these scratches around the neck, fresh marks. I should say, as if something had been fastened to it quite recently." The evidence was mounting in ways that painted an increasingly troubling picture. Miss Marple carefully examined the cork stopper, noting how it showed signs of having been secured with some sort of cord or strap. A faint shiny film around the bottle's neck suggested repeated contact with leather or fabric. Returning to the Lychgate tracks, Miss Marple made another discovery. Embedded in the soft earth near where the perambulator had been positioned was a tiny fragment of stoneware glaze, a chip that matched perfectly with a fresh nick she now noticed on the foot warmer's surface. "The evidence suggests," she said slowly, "that this foot warmer was removed from the pram, used for some purpose that caused it to be chipped and marked, then disposed of in the water trough to cool, or perhaps to wash away traces of whatever it had been used for." The implications were becoming increasingly sinister. A foot warmer, designed to provide warmth and comfort for babies, had apparently been employed for some entirely different purpose, one that required it to be hidden immediately afterward. But what possible use could a stoneware bottle serve? Lady Bantry wondered aloud. That would require such secrecy and deception. Miss Marple's expression had grown grave as she contemplated the various possibilities. A heavy, rounded object that could be easily concealed, then quickly disposed of, she mused. The characteristics matched uncomfortably well with Dr. Haydock's description of whatever had struck poor Mr. Finch. "I begin to suspect," she said quietly, "that Mrs. Rowan's elaborate performance with the babies and perambulator was designed to provide her with the perfect cover for bringing a weapon into our midst, a weapon that appeared entirely innocent and appropriate to her assumed role." The morning's Discoveries had transformed yesterday's curious inconsistencies into evidence of deliberate planning and calculated deception. What had begun as a simple funeral service was revealing itself to be the setting for a carefully orchestrated crime, one that had used the symbols of maternal care and family duty to mask its true purpose. As they prepared to return to the village to share their findings with the proper authorities, Miss Marple cast one final glance at the peaceful churchyard where so many of St. Mary Mead's residents rested in eternal sleep. Soon, she feared that number would include Mr. Finch, not as a victim of natural causes, but as the target of a murder that had been planned with chilling attention to detail. Chapter 6. 2 cards. 1 hand. The discovery of the discarded foot warmer had lent new urgency to Miss Marple's investigation, and she found herself eager to examine other aspects of the previous day's events with fresh eyes. After securing the stoneware bottle as evidence, she and Lady Bantry made their way to the church vestry, where Reverend Clement maintained the various administrative materials associated with parish functions. The rector greeted them with the slightly harried manner of one whose routine had been thoroughly disrupted by unexpected tragedy. His normally cheerful countenance bore the strain of having to manage both the spiritual and practical aspects of Mr. Finch's sudden death. "Most dreadful business," he said, gesturing them into the small vestry chamber. "Poor Finch, to think he should meet his end on what should have been a day of peaceful mourning and reflection." Miss Marple expressed appropriate sympathy before broaching her real purpose. "Leonard, I wonder if you might still have the order of service cards from yesterday. I'm particularly interested in the seating arrangements." Reverend Clement looked puzzled but cooperative. "Certainly, though I can't imagine what significance they might hold." Griselda insisted on maintaining proper organization, so we prepared name cards for the principal mourners. He produced a small collection of cream-colored cards from the vestry desk, each bearing the printed order of service on one side and penciled initials on the reverse to indicate seating assignments. Miss Marple examined them with the careful attention she might have devoted to deciphering an ancient manuscript. "How interesting," she murmured, selecting 2 cards from the collection. "Lady Bantry, would you be so kind as to observe the handwriting on these particular specimens?" Lady Bantry peered over Miss Marple's shoulder at the cards in question. One bore the initials LR in neat, precise script, while another showed HF in what appeared to be identical penmanship. "The hand is remarkably similar," Dolly observed, "almost as if they were written by the same person." "My thoughts exactly," Miss Marple agreed. "Yet one would naturally expect Mrs. Finch to have prepared her own seating card. Would one not?" Reverend Clement approached to examine the evidence, his scholarly instincts engaged by this puzzle of paleography. "Most peculiar. I distinctly recall seeing Hester sign her own card at this very table before the service began. Her handwriting is quite distinctive, rather shaky, poor dear. Understandably so, under the circumstances." Miss Marple held the cards up to the light from the vestry window, studying them with the thoroughness of a forensic expert. On the card marked LR, a faint smear of white powder was visible near the top edge, precisely where a gloved finger might have pressed while handling the card. "The same talcum residue we observed elsewhere," she noted quietly. "This suggests that Mrs. Rowan, or whoever she truly is, not only prepared her own seating card, but also handled Mrs. Finch's arrangement." The implications were troubling. Why would a visiting stranger involve herself in the administrative details of someone else's funeral? And what circumstances would allow her access to materials that should have been managed by family members or close friends? Reverend Clement was clearly becoming agitated by these revelations. "Are you suggesting that this Mrs. Rowan somehow interfered with our arrangements? But that would be most irregular, positively improper." I fear, Miss Marple replied gently, that irregularity and impropriety are among the lesser concerns raised by yesterday's events. Leonard, might I ask who else assisted with the preparation of these cards? Well, Basil Rudge offered his help naturally. Most generous of him, considering his own grief over losing such a valued colleague. He's been quite devoted to parish business since taking over as assistant treasurer. At the mention of Mr. Rudge's name, Miss Marple felt another piece of the puzzle shifting into place. The haberdasher had indeed been conspicuous in his eagerness to assist with various arrangements, and his proximity to the parish financial affairs gave him particular reason for concern about Mr. Finch's welfare. Did Mr. Rudge handle any of these specific cards? She inquired, indicating the suspicious specimens. Reverend Clement frowned in concentration. I believe he may have distributed several of them. Helped to organize the seating, you understand? Most thoughtful of him to take on such details during our time of distress. Miss Marple examined the remaining cards with renewed interest, comparing the various hands represented in the penciled initials. The majority showed individual characteristics consistent with personal preparation, but the two cards that concerned her stood out clearly as products of the same writer. There's something else, she observed, holding one card at an angle to catch the light. The pressure of the pencil stroke suggests someone writing with their non-dominant hand, perhaps attempting to disguise their natural penmanship. However did you determine that? Lady Bantry asked, impressed. The hesitation marks, my dear. Notice how the curves are slightly uncertain, the way one's writing becomes when using the opposite hand from usual. It's a technique sometimes employed when one wishes to conceal one's identity through correspondence. This discovery added yet another layer of premeditation to what was emerging as an increasingly complex scheme. Someone had not only arranged for Mrs. Rowan's presence at the funeral, but had also taken care to ensure that her seating was properly organized, and that Mrs. Finch's card bore handwriting that matched her own. Reverend Clement had grown quite pale as the implications became clearer. But this suggests that poor Hester was somehow involved in whatever deception took place. Surely that's impossible. She's the victim's own wife. Not necessarily involved willingly, Leonard, Miss Marple replied carefully. Consider how easily someone in a state of grief might accept assistance with arrangements they found overwhelming. A helpful stranger offering to manage small details might seem like a blessing rather than a threat. The vestry had grown quite still as they contemplated these disturbing possibilities. Outside, the normal sounds of village life continued, birds singing, cartwheels on cobblestones, the distant lowing of cattle, but within the small chamber, the atmosphere had become charged with the recognition that yesterday's events had been far more sinister than anyone had initially suspected. There's one more aspect that troubles me, Miss Marple continued, studying the cards once more. The timing of these preparations suggests considerable advanced planning. Someone knew enough about our parish procedures to anticipate exactly what would be required, and how to integrate themselves seamlessly into our arrangements. Lady Bantry shuddered slightly. It's rather ghastly to think of such calculation going into what should have been a simple act of mourning and respect. Miss Marple nodded gravely. Indeed, the perversion of genuine grief and community solidarity for criminal purposes represents a particularly disturbing form of cynicism. As they prepared to leave the vestry, Miss Marple carefully gathered the suspicious cards for further examination. Each small discovery was contributing to a larger pattern of deception, one that suggested the entire elaborate performance of the previous day had been orchestrated to conceal murder beneath a respectable facade of funeral observances. The question that remained was identifying the true architect of this scheme and understanding what motive could justify such an intricate and heartless manipulation of the community's natural compassion. Chapter 7. Tracks with a double wheel armed. With the evidence of the fraudulent seating cards, Miss Marple felt compelled to return to the lich gate for a more thorough examination of the physical traces left by Mrs. Rowan's mysterious perambulator. The morning sun had dried the earth sufficiently to make detailed study possible, and she approached the task with the systematic thoroughness of an archaeologist, uncovering ancient secrets. Inspector Slack had arrived at the church grounds on some official business related to finalizing his report on Mr. Finch's death, and Miss Marple seized the opportunity to share her growing concerns about the previous day's events. She found him in the porch, making notes with the punctilious manner of one whose mind was already made up. "Inspector," she began diplomatically, "I wonder if you might spare a moment to examine some rather curious evidence that has come to light." Slack looked up from his notebook with the expression of barely suppressed irritation that she had learned to expect from their previous encounters. "Miss Marple, I've told you the matter is quite straightforward. Poor old gentleman, overcome by the strain of the occasion. Natural causes, pure and simple." "Nevertheless," she persisted gently, "there are certain physical details that might interest you. For instance, the tracks left by Mrs. Rowan's perambulator show some rather unusual characteristics. Lady Bantry, who had been examining the Lichgate area while this conversation took place, called out with evident excitement, 'Jane, do come and look at this.' The wheel marks tell quite a remarkable story." With obvious reluctance, Inspector Slack followed Miss Marple to where Dolly was kneeling beside the clearer set of tracks. The twin front wheels of the perambulator had indeed left distinctive impressions in the soft earth, and careful study revealed a pattern that raised significant questions about the vehicle's movements. "Observe," Miss Marple said, indicating the various marks with a stick she had picked up for the purpose. "Here we see the tracks as the pram approached the Lich Gate, perfectly straight and purposeful, exactly what one would expect from someone seeking shelter from the rain." Inspector Slack nodded impatiently. Yes, natural enough. But here," Miss Marple continued, moving to another set of impressions, "the tracks show the wheels turning backward, then angling sharply to the left. Notice how there's no gradual turning circle as there would be if someone was simply maneuvering the pram in the normal fashion." Lady Bantry pointed to additional markings nearby. "And these scuff marks suggest the rear of the pram was lifted and swung around, rather than being pushed in the ordinary way." The evidence was indeed compelling when viewed with proper attention. The tracks clearly showed that the perambulator had been positioned with unusual care and precision, suggesting purposes far beyond simple shelter-seeking. Missy Marple directed their attention to the ancient oak bench built into the Lich Gate roof structure. "Inspector, would you be so kind as to examine this bench? I believe you'll find some interesting marks on the surface." With growing annoyance but obvious curiosity, Slack climbed onto the bench to study its weathered surface. Almost immediately, his expression changed from irritation to genuine interest. "Fresh scuffs," he admitted grudgingly, "and what appears to be some sort of grease mark running along the edge here. The length of a strap." "Perhaps," Miss Marple suggested innocently. The inspector's examination became more thorough as he began to appreciate the significance of what he was seeing. The marks on the bench were indeed fresh, and their pattern suggested that something flexible, a strap or cord, had been drawn across the surface under considerable tension. "There's something else. Inspector," Lady Bantry called from her position near the stone gate posts. "This post here shows what looks like a fresh impact mark, precisely at head height for a standing person." Slack descended from the bench and examined the stone post with professional interest. The mark was subtle but unmistakable, a bruise in the ancient stone that showed signs of recent impact from some blunt, heavy object. Miss Marple moved to position herself beside the post, demonstrating the height and angle that would be required for such an impact. If one were to imagine a weighted object suspended from the bench corner by a strap or cord, and then swung with sufficient force, the implications hung in the air between them like the morning mist that still clung to the churchyard trees. What they were looking at was not the scene of an accident, but the carefully prepared site of a calculated assault. "Good Lord," Inspector Slack muttered, his earlier certainty clearly shaken. "You're suggesting that someone used this lich gate as some sort of, what would you call it? A domestic version of a medieval siege engine," Miss Marple replied quietly. "Crude but effective, and with the advantage of being completely dismantled and concealed within moments of use. The morning's discoveries had transformed their understanding of the previous day's events entirely. What had appeared to be a tragic accident was revealing itself as an ingeniously planned murder, one that had used the very symbols of maternal care and community sympathy as camouflage for deadly intent. Inspector Slack was now examining the evidence with the thoroughness that Miss Marple had hoped to inspire from the beginning. He measured distances, tested angles, and made careful notes about the positioning of the various marks and impressions. The timing would have been crucial, he mused, his professional instincts fully engaged. The perpetrator would have needed to know exactly when Mr. Finch would be in position, and how to strike without being observed by other mourners. "Indeed," Miss Marple agreed, "and they would have required considerable familiarity with the layout of our churchyard, as well as advanced knowledge of the funeral arrangements." "This was not a crime of opportunity, Inspector, but one of meticulous planning." Lady Bantry had been following their reconstruction with horrified fascination. "But the babies, surely no one could use innocent children as part of such a scheme." "The babies provided the perfect justification for Mrs. Rowan's presence," Miss Marple explained, "and her need to position the perambulator in a specific location. They also ensured that no one would look too closely at the contents of the pram." Who would suspect a weapon hidden beneath infant supplies? The psychological cunning behind the scheme was perhaps even more disturbing than its mechanical ingenuity. Someone had calculated that the natural sympathy evoked by a devoted aunt caring for her sister's children would provide perfect cover for their deadly preparations. Spectre Slack straightened up from his examination of the stone post, his expression grim with the recognition of how thoroughly he had misjudged the situation. "Miss Marple, I owe you an apology. This is clearly not the simple accident I initially concluded." "Think nothing of it, Inspector," she replied graciously. "The deception was expertly crafted to mislead exactly such preliminary examinations. We're dealing with someone of considerable intelligence and planning ability." As they prepared to leave the Lich Gate area, Miss Marple took one final look at the scene that had served as the stage for such calculated violence. The ancient wooden structure had witnessed countless farewells over the centuries, but never before had its sheltering roof been perverted to serve such dark purposes. The investigation had moved far beyond the simple examination of curious inconsistencies. They were now confronted with clear evidence of premeditated murder committed by someone who possessed both the mechanical ingenuity to devise such a method and the psychological sophistication to execute it beneath the very noses of an entire community. The question that remained was identifying this person among the mourners who had gathered to pay their respects to poor Mr. Finch, someone who had turned the solemn occasion of his funeral into the perfect opportunity for his destruction. Chapter 8. The Clinic Ledger, the Eye. Revelation of the Lich Gate's sinister purpose had galvanized Inspector Slack into proper investigative action, and Miss Marple found herself pleased to observe his transformation from dismissive official to genuine professional engagement. Their next destination was the district clinic, where Sister Ivy Madden's meticulous Record keeping might provide crucial insights into the mysterious Mrs. Rowan's true identity and preparations. Sister Madden received them with the grave satisfaction of one whose suspicions had been vindicated by subsequent events. She led them directly to her office, where the clinic ledger lay open on her desk like an accusatory document awaiting examination. "I've been reviewing yesterday's entries with considerable care," she announced without preamble. "Most illuminating, I must say, and deeply disturbing from a professional standpoint." The ledger showed neat columns recording the distribution of various supplies to mothers and caregivers under Sister Madden's supervision. Miss Marple studied the entries with her customary attention to detail, while Inspector Slack examined them with the focused intensity of one who had learned not to overlook seemingly minor inconsistencies. "Here," Sister Madden said, pointing to a specific entry with a finger that trembled slightly with suppressed indignation. "Yesterday morning, Lydia Rowan signed out 2 spare teats and 1 pram strap, ostensibly for her sister's use. The handwriting in the ledger was immediately recognizable as the same neat script they had observed on the funeral seating cards. But more significant was the marginal note that accompanied the entry: to bring babies to church. Most irregular," Sister Madden continued. "Proper mothers arrange their supplies well in advance of any public outing. To request materials on the very morning of such an expedition suggests either extremely poor planning or deliberate acquisition of specific items for purposes unrelated to infant care." Miss Marple finished quietly, "Or both." Inspector Slack was making careful notes, his earlier skepticism completely replaced by professional thoroughness. "This pram strap, what would be its normal function?" "Securing blankets or supplies within the perambulator," Sister Madden explained, "though I must say any properly equipped pram would already possess adequate restraining devices. To request an additional strap suggests either replacement of damaged equipment." She paused meaningfully, allowing the implications to settle over her listeners, "or the need for a securing device for some purpose entirely outside normal infant care," Miss Marple observed. Their investigation was interrupted by the arrival of Nora Pike from the village shop, who had come to deliver some supplies but lingered with the obvious intention of sharing information she considered significant. "Begging your pardon," Nora said with the satisfied air of one bearing important intelligence, "but I couldn't help overhearing your discussion about this Mrs. Rowan. I served her myself yesterday morning. Around 11 it was." Inspector Slack looked up from his notes with interest. "What did she purchase?" "Milk, for one thing. A full bottle, fresh from Farmer Hartwell's morning delivery, and a bottle brush as well, which struck me as odd at the time." Miss Marple exchanged a meaningful glance with Lady Bantry. The milk purchase explained the mysterious rings they had discovered on the arms, ledge and church porch flagstone, but raised new questions about Mrs. Rowan's true activities. "Did she mention why she needed these particular items?" Miss Marple inquired gently. "Said something about preparing properly for an outing with her sister's babies. Very particular about the milk being fresh. She insisted on testing the temperature herself before accepting it." This detail aligned perfectly with their growing understanding of Mrs. Rowan's careful preparations. Every element of her elaborate deception had been planned and rehearsed, from the acquisition of appropriate supplies to the timing of her various activities. Their next stop was Rudge and Son, the haberdashery, where Mr. Basil Rudge conducted his business with the flustered efficiency that had characterized his behavior throughout the previous day's events. They found him arranging displays with nervous energy, clearly agitated by the morning's developments. "Terrible business about poor Finch," he said without looking up from his work. "Though I suppose Inspector Slack has everything well in hand. Natural causes, wasn't it? Heart failure brought on by the strain." Inspector Slack's response was notably non-committal. We're still examining all the evidence, Mr. Rudge. I understand you were acquainted with Mrs. Rowan. Rudge's hand stilled on the fabric he had been adjusting. Mrs. Rowan? I'm not sure you mean the lady with the perambulator? Yes, I believe I may have served her yesterday morning. Cash sale, if I recall correctly, Miss. Marple observed how Rudge avoided meeting their eyes directly, a behavior pattern that suggested considerable discomfort with the line of inquiry. Might we examine your sales ledger from yesterday? Inspector Slack requested with the firm politeness that indicated this was not truly a request. Rudge hesitated visibly before producing the relevant book. The entry was immediately apparent. Cash, Rowan, written in a hand different from the surrounding entries, then overwritten in what appeared to be Basil's own script. Your assistant made the original entry? Miss Marple inquired mildly. Yes, that's right. But I corrected it afterward. You see, wanted to ensure proper record-keeping. Rudge's explanation sounded rehearsed and unconvincing. Inspector Slack was examining the ledger with professional skepticism. What exactly did Mrs. Rowan purchase? Oh, the usual items, thread, needles, that sort of thing. Nothing particularly memorable. Rudge's vagueness was clearly deliberate, and his nervousness was becoming more pronounced with each question. Miss Marple had been studying the shop's inventory while this conversation progressed, and something caught her attention. Mr. Rudge, do you stock safety pins of various makes? Certainly essential household items. I carry several brands to suit different preferences and budgets. Might I ask which brand specifically? Rudge moved to display a selection of pins, pointing out the various manufacturers and qualities. Baby Joy is our most popular domestic line. Excellent quality at reasonable prices. We also stock some imported varieties for customers with particular requirements. Miss Marple noted that the display included no pins bearing the mother's pride marking they had discovered on Mrs. Finch's mourning jacket. This absence was significant. It suggested that whoever had placed that pin had obtained it elsewhere, possibly specifically for the purpose of creating false evidence. As they prepared to leave the shop, Tom Ransom appeared at the doorway, his undertaker's duties apparently complete for the morning. His weathered face showed the troubled expression of one wrestling with uncomfortable knowledge. Begging your pardon, Inspector, he said hesitantly, but I've been thinking about yesterday's events, and there's something that's been troubling me. Please go ahead, Inspector Slack encouraged. It's about that perambulator Mrs. Rowan was using. I've been in this business long enough to notice details about wheeled conveyances, and that pram had something I don't often see in these parts. He paused, clearly gathering his thoughts before continuing. A higher stencil on the axle, faded but visible if you know where to look. From a reading agency, unless I'm much mistaken. He looked around at their faces. Now, why would a local woman need to hire a pram for her sister's babies? This revelation added yet another layer of premeditation to the increasingly complex scheme. Mrs. Rowan had not simply borrowed babies and supplies. She had hired the very conveyance that would serve as both camouflage and weapon delivery system for her murderous purpose. The evidence was mounting systematically, painting a picture of calculation and forethought that transformed the previous day's events from tragic accident to carefully orchestrated assassination. Chapter 9. The Pin That Didn't Belong. The discovery of the hired perambulator had added a final damning piece to the puzzle of Mrs. Rowan's elaborate deception. But Miss Marple sensed that one crucial element remained unexplored: the question of motive. What could possibly justify such an intricate and heartless scheme demanded investigation into the relationships and circumstances surrounding Mr. Finch's life and death. With Inspector Slack's newfound cooperation, they made their way to the modest house where Mrs. Hester Finch was receiving condolences from neighbors and arranging the practical matters that death invariably imposes upon the living. The widow received them with the composed dignity she had maintained throughout the previous day's ordeal, though close observation revealed the strain beneath her careful composure. "Mrs. Finch," Miss Marple began gently, "I wonder if I might borrow your morning jacket for just a moment. There's a small detail I'd like to examine, if you wouldn't mind." Mrs. Finch looked puzzled but compliant, fetching the black garment from where it hung in the hallway. Miss Marple accepted it with a careful reverence due to such a solemn article, then proceeded to shake it gently over a clean white handkerchief she had spread upon the table. The result was immediate and illuminating. A tiny safety pin fell onto the handkerchief. Cheap, nickel-plated metal bearing the stamped inscription, "Mother's Pride," in small but legible letters. Inspector Slack examined the pin with professional interest. London manufacturer by the look of it. Not the sort of thing one would expect to find in a village shop. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. Indeed, and certainly not the brand that Mr. Rudge stocks in his establishment. He carries baby joy pins exclusively for domestic trade. Mrs. Finch looked genuinely bewildered by this discovery. "I can't imagine how such a thing came to be on my jacket. I never use safety pins, particularly not such cheap ones. My late husband was most particular about proper dress fastenings. When did you last wear this jacket before yesterday?" Miss Marple inquired. "Not for several months. It's been hanging in the wardrobe since the spring when I wore it to Mrs. Weatherby's funeral. I remember checking it carefully before yesterday's service. It appeared perfectly clean and ready. The implications were disturbing. Someone had deliberately placed this foreign pin on Mrs. Finch's morning attire, presumably as part of a larger scheme to implicate her in her husband's death." Miss Marple recalled the moment during the funeral discovery where Mrs. Rowan had knelt beside Mrs. Finch, ostensibly to straighten the widow's cuff. The gesture had seemed natural at the time, a small kindness from one woman to another during a moment of distress. Now it appeared far more sinister. "Inspector?" Slack was making careful notes about the pin's provenance and placement. "This suggests premeditation of a very sophisticated sort. Someone wanted to ensure that suspicion would fall upon Mrs. Finch if questions arose about her husband's death. Dr. Haydock arrived during their examination, having come to check on the widow's welfare. His medical manner remained professionally concerned, but Miss Marple detected an undercurrent of unease that suggested he had been reflecting on the previous day's events with growing discomfort. "Doctor," she said diplomatically, "might I ask about Mr. Finch's general health and circumstances in recent weeks? Were there any particular concerns or changes in his routine?" Dr. Haydock considered this carefully before responding. Aldous had been under some strain, I must admit. He'd taken out a new life insurance policy recently, quite substantial, as I understand it, and he'd been making remarks about needing to set the parish accounts in proper order before any significant changes occurred. This revelation cast an entirely new light on the timing of Mr. Finch's death. If he had been contemplating major changes to the financial arrangements he oversaw, several people might have found themselves in uncomfortable positions. Did he mention any specific concerns about the accounts? Inspector Slack inquired. "Nothing detailed," Dr. Haydock replied, but he seemed troubled by some discrepancies he had discovered. Mentioned something about needing to have serious conversations with his assistant about proper bookkeeping procedures. Mrs. Finch had been listening to this exchange with growing attention. Oh yes, he was quite concerned about Basil Rudge's handling of certain transactions. Poor Aldous was always so meticulous. He couldn't bear the thought of sloppy record-keeping, especially where parish funds were concerned. The motive was becoming clearer. If Mr. Rudge had been engaging in financial irregularities, Mr. Finch's threatened investigation could have spelled Ruin for the haberdasher's reputation and livelihood. The new insurance policy would have provided Mrs. Finch with financial security, making her a convenient suspect if questions arose about her husband's sudden death. But the physical evidence pointed in a different direction entirely. Miss Marple reflected on the heightened strength required to operate the improvised weapon they had reconstructed at the lich gate. Mrs. Finch was a small, delicate woman whose right-handed nature and tremulous movements hardly suggested the capability for such violence. The bruised pattern on the stone post, she mused aloud, indicated a left-handed swing from someone tall enough and strong enough to lift the rear of a loaded perambulator. She turned to the widow. "Mrs. Finch, might I observe your natural hand preference?" The widow demonstrated her right-handed nature by signing her name in the guest book that neighbors had been maintaining. Her script was indeed shaky, quite different from the firm, controlled handwriting they had observed on the seating cards and clinic ledger. Miss Marple found herself thinking of Mrs. Rowan's compact, efficient movements around the perambulator, the way she had maneuvered the unwieldy conveyance with practiced ease. There had been something almost professional about her handling of both the mechanical aspects and the babies themselves. "Inspector," she said thoughtfully, "I believe we need to learn more about this mysterious Mrs. Rowan's background and qualifications. Someone with her evident expertise in infant care and perambulator management didn't acquire such skills casually." Dr. Haydock had been following their deductions with growing concern. "You're suggesting that this woman was specifically chosen? That someone recruited her deliberately for this purpose?" "I'm suggesting," Miss Marple replied, "that we're dealing with a conspiracy that required both financial motivation and specialized execution. Mr. Rudge had compelling reasons to silence Mr. Finch, but he lacked the physical capability and professional knowledge to carry out such a complex scheme alone. The Pori investigation had evolved from a simple murder inquiry into something far more elaborate, a carefully orchestrated conspiracy that had manipulated the genuine grief and sympathy of an entire community to provide cover for calculated violence." Sister Madden had been remarkably quiet during these revelations, but now she spoke with the authority of one whose professional experience provided crucial insight. "There's something I should mention about women who work with foundlings and unwanted infants. They develop particular skills, not just in handling babies, but in moving about institutions quietly, managing heavy equipment, and maintaining composure under difficult circumstances." She paused meaningfully before continuing. 2 years ago, we had a nurse in the foundling ward, Nurse Lydia. Ronry dismissed for borrowing infants for unauthorized airing expeditions and for maintaining inappropriate relationships with male visitors during working hours. A woman quite capable with weights and perambulators and willing to bend regulations for the right compensation. The final piece of the puzzle had fallen into place. Mrs. Rowan was Nurse Ronry, hired by someone who knew her history and was prepared to exploit her particular combination of skills and moral flexibility. Chapter 10. Lichgate, a prom, a wait. A blow the gathering under the lich gate on the following morning bore little resemblance to the solemn funeral assembly of 2 days past. Inspector Slack had arranged for the principal figures in the case to witness Miss Marple's reconstruction of the crime, understanding that nothing short of a complete demonstration would suffice to unravel the intricate web of deception that had been woven around Mr. Finch's murder. The gray September sky remained overcast, lending an appropriately somber atmosphere to the proceedings. Mrs. Finch stood beside her brother-in-law, her black mourning dress a stark reminder of the genuine grief that had been so cynically exploited. Dr. Haydock maintained his professional composure, though his expression betrayed deep concern about the revelations that were about to unfold. Sister Madden had positioned herself with military precision, her sharp eyes missing nothing of the scene's careful preparation. Most significantly, Mr. Basil Rudge had been prevailed upon to attend, his usual eager demeanor replaced by a pale nervousness that had intensified visibly throughout the morning's developments. He stood slightly apart from the other mourners, his hands clasping and unclasping with involuntary anxiety. Miss Marple had requested that a perambulator similar to the one used in the crime be brought to illustrate her points, and Tom Ransom had obligingly provided one from his collection of funeral equipment. The stoneware foot warmer recovered from the water trough sat nearby as evidence of the weapon's true nature. Ladies and gentlemen, Miss Marple began with the quiet authority that commanded attention despite her modest manner. We are here to examine how a simple domestic appliance, a perambulator designed to provide comfort and safety for infants, was perverted into an instrument of calculated murder. She moved to the foot warmer, handling it with a careful respect due to evidence in a capital case. This stoneware bottle was filled with scalding water early yesterday morning, creating the perfect justification for its presence in the pram. However, just before the conclusion of the funeral service, it was emptied of its warming contents and repurposed for an entirely different function. Lady Bantry, who had been granted permission to observe the reconstruction, watched with horrified fascination as Miss Marple demonstrated how the bottle could be secured to one of Sister Madden's pram straps. The strap was looped over the corner of this lich-gate bench, Miss Marple continued, indicating the ancient wooden structure above their heads. The foot warmer was then fastened to create a pendulum of considerable weight and striking force. She gestured toward the stone post where the impact mark remained visible. The perambulator's tail was lifted and positioned to create the proper angle for the swing. When pulled with sufficient force, the weighted strap would follow an arc precisely calculated to strike someone standing at this location, at temple height. Inspector Slack had been following the demonstration with professional attention. But the timing would have been crucial. How could the perpetrator ensure that Mr. Finch would be in exactly the right position? The answer lies in understanding the careful preparation that preceded the crime, Miss Marple replied. Our investigation has revealed that someone with intimate knowledge of our parish procedures and access to our arrangements had been planning this for some time. Mead turned her attention to the evidence they had accumulated over the past 2 days. The clinic ledger shows that Lydia Rowan acquired the necessary strap and other supplies on the morning of the funeral. The seating cards reveal that the same person had handled both her own placement and Mrs. Finch's, ensuring proper positioning for the crime's execution. Mr. Rudge had grown increasingly pale during this recitation, his nervous movements becoming more pronounced with each revelation. The milk rings we discovered in the church porch and on the arms ledge tell us that the perpetrator tested her feeding bottle and tended to restless infants moments before carrying out the attack. The talc residue on the stone pillar shows where she steadied herself during the crucial moment of the crime's execution. Miss Marple paused to allow these details to settle in her listeners' minds before continuing with the most damning evidence. But perhaps most revealing of all was the safety pin planted on Mrs. Finch's mourning jacket, a pin of a brand not sold locally, placed there during the confusion following the crime's discovery. This was intended to provide false evidence against the victim's widow should questions arise about his death. Mrs. Finch pressed a handkerchief to her eyes, clearly distressed by the realization of how thoroughly she had been manipulated and used as an unwitting part of the criminal scheme. The physical evidence tells us that the crime required considerable strength and left-handed dexterity, Miss Marple observed, studying the assembled group carefully. The person responsible had to be capable of lifting a loaded perambulator's rear end and swinging the weighted weapon with lethal force. She turned her penetrating gaze toward Mr. Rudge, whose agitation had reached the point where he was visibly trembling. "Mr. Rudge, your account books show overwritten entries for Mrs. Rowan's purchases, suggesting your direct involvement in providing her with funds and supplies. Your eagerness to assist with funeral arrangements gave you access to seating cards and administrative details. Most significantly, your position as assistant parish treasurer meant that Mr. Finch's threatened investigation of the accounts would have exposed whatever irregularities you had been concealing." Rudge's composure finally cracked. "Completely. It wasn't supposed to happen like this," he burst out. "Aldous was going to ruin everything, destroy my reputation, my business, everything I'd worked for. I only borrowed from the parish funds temporarily, meant to replace it all when trade improved." Inspector Slack stepped forward with official authority. "Basil Rudge, I am arresting you for conspiracy in the murder of Aldous Finch. But I didn't kill him myself." Rudge protested desperately. "I couldn't have managed such a thing. I haven't the strength or the knowledge. Lydia did the actual deed." Miss Marple nodded with grim satisfaction. "Indeed, Nurse Lydia Ronry, formerly of the Foundling Ward, dismissed 2 years ago for borrowing infants and maintaining inappropriate relationships with male visitors. A woman skilled in handling perambulators and babies, and willing to hire both her services and her silence for the right compensation." The revelation of the conspiracy's full scope sent a chill through the assembled mourners. The calculated cynicism of using borrowed babies and maternal imagery to mask murder represented a perversion of natural human sympathy that struck them all as particularly heinous. "Where is this Nurse Ronry now?" Inspector Slack demanded. "Long gone, I should imagine," Miss Marple replied calmly. Her role was to execute the crime and disappear, leaving Mr. Rudge to maintain his position of apparent innocence while suspicion fell upon the bereaved widow. As Inspector Slack led the pale and shaking haberdasher away, the remaining mourners stood in stunned silence beneath the lich gate that had served as the instrument of such calculated violence. Lady Bantry fingered the small safety pin that had been intended to condemn an innocent woman. "Babies at a funeral," she murmured. "How utterly horrid." Miss Marple folded her knitting with the methodical precision that characterized all her activities. "Yes, my dear, the domestic and the dreadful are often neighbors. Babies cry, milk spills, talc drifts. Those tiny things tell the truth, even when people, however neatly, try to move it about." The ancient lich gate stood silent above them, its weathered beams having witnessed both genuine grief and calculated deception, reminding all who pass beneath it that evil often wears the mask of ordinary human kindness.